One contract, one dinner, one woman nobody looked at twice. About to save everything. She was just a waitress, standing still, hands trembling, wearing a wrinkled uniform that smelled like kitchen grease and cheap detergent. While tailored suits laughed at her, she was reading something none of them had caught, something that was about to change every single life in that room. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told you didn't belong, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The cold came early that November. Not the kind of cold that creeps in gradually, that gives you time to pull out your heavier coat and mentally prepare for the season ahead. This was the sharp, rude kind. The kind that slapped you across the face the moment you stepped outside, that found every gap in your scarf, every thin patch in your gloves, and reminded you, without apology, that the city had no particular interest in your comfort. Sophie Bennett felt it the moment she stepped off the subway at 57th Street, the wind tunneling down the avenue like it had somewhere important to be. She tucked her chin into the collar of her coat, the one with the broken zipper she'd been meaning to fix for 3 months, and walked faster. Her shift started at 7. It was 6:42. She had exactly 18 minutes to change into her uniform, tie her hair back, run through the evening's reservation list with the floor manager, and somehow quiet the low-grade anxiety that lived permanently somewhere behind her sternum. She had a contracts law midterm in 4 days. Her mother's next treatment was on Friday, and the heating in her apartment had stopped working sometime around 3 in the morning, which meant she'd slept in 2 sweaters and still woken up with her breath visible in the dark. She was 30 years old, and most days she felt about 60. Crown Aurelia sat at the end of a discreet block in Midtown, the kind of restaurant that didn't advertise itself because it didn't need to. No neon sign, no Yelp listing, no social media presence worth mentioning, just a carved wooden door, a small brass plate engraved with the restaurant's name, and 2 enormous men in dark coats stationed outside like sentinels. If you had to ask how to get a reservation, you probably couldn't afford one. If you showed up without one, you were turned away so politely that you almost didn't realize what had happened until you were already back on the sidewalk. Sophie had worked there for 2 years. She entered through the service entrance, the way she always did, nodding to Marco the dishwasher as she passed through the kitchen corridor. The back of the house was already in controlled chaos. Line cooks shouting in 3 languages, the percussion of pans, the sharp smell of reduced wine and butter, and something roasting that cost more per pound than Sophie made in a shift. She changed quickly in the staff room, pulling on the fitted black uniform that was 3 sizes too big because the restaurant had run out of her size when she started and never bothered to order more. She'd safety pinned it in 2 places to keep it from swimming on her frame, but it still made her look like she was playing dress-up in someone else's clothes. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the lockers. Dark circles, hair that needed a trim 2 months ago. A small scar above her left eyebrow from a car door incident she'd rather not think about. She looked exactly like what she was, someone who was tired, running behind, and doing her absolute best. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and went out to face the dining room. Matep. The floor manager, James, was a compact man with excellent posture and the slightly haunted look of someone who had spent 15 years managing the expectations of people who believed their happiness was his personal responsibility. Sophie. He said her name like a greeting and a warning at the same time. Table 7 tonight. The private investment dinner. She felt her stomach tighten slightly. The whole table. The whole table. 8 covers. They've booked the East Wing alcove for privacy. He handed her a printed card with the reservation details. There are documents on the table. They arrived ahead of the guests and were placed specifically. Do not touch them. Do not move them. Do not allow water or anything else near them. Understood. These are not ordinary guests, Sophie. James, none of our guests are ordinary guests. He almost smiled. These are especially not ordinary. One of them is Ethan Vaughn. The name landed without any visible effect on Sophie's expression, though internally she ran a quick calculation. Ethan Vaughn. She'd read about him once in a business journal she'd borrowed from the law school library, not because she was particularly interested in Manhattan real estate empires, but because his company had been involved in a landmark case about commercial lease interpretation that her professor had referenced. 32 years old, one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the city, notoriously private, notoriously difficult. Got it, she said. And Sophie, James lowered his voice slightly. Elaine Voss will also be at the table. That name she recognized differently. Everyone in the service industry recognized that name differently. Elaine Voss was the kind of woman who left one-star reviews in restaurants that didn't exist on any public platform. She had her own channels, her own networks, and a reputation for making quiet trouble for anyone who crossed her. She was glamorous in the way that expensive things are glamorous, perfect on the surface, and fundamentally cold underneath. "I'll be careful," Sophie said. "Please," said James, with the sincerity of a man who genuinely needed her to be. Ethan Vaughn arrived at 7:15, which was 15 minutes late, and also somehow exactly on time because every other guest had been seated and waiting for precisely that interval, and his entrance, quiet, unannounced, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Sophie's annual rent, felt less like an arrival and more like a weather event. The room didn't stop exactly, but it shifted, the way a building shifts almost imperceptibly when the wind changes direction. Sophie noticed because Sophie always noticed things. She had been doing a last check on the table settings when he walked in, and she caught only a glimpse before redirecting her attention to a wine glass that needed realigning. Tall, dark hair that looked like he'd run a hand through it once and then forgotten about it. Eyes that scanned the room the way someone's eyes scan a room when they've learned not to trust it. Quick, efficient, settling on nothing too long. He didn't smile when he greeted the others at the table. He shook hands. He sat down. He picked up the agenda card, glanced at it, and placed it back. He did not look at the menu. He did not look at Sophie when she approached to introduce herself in the evening service. That was fine. Most of them didn't. "Good evening," she said, addressing the table with the careful, measured warmth she'd learned to manufacture after 2 years of serving people who would never think of her again once they left. "My name is Sophie, and I'll be taking care of you this evening. Can I begin by—" "Water," said Elaine Voss without looking up from her phone. She was seated to Ethan's right, wearing a silk dress the color of champagne and jewelry that caught the candlelight with aggressive intent. "Still, room temperature, and make sure the glasses are actually clean this time. Last month someone brought me a glass with a lipstick mark on the rim, and I still haven't recovered from the trauma." Several people at the table laughed lightly. Sophie said, "Of course," and moved away. She'd learned, after about 6 months of doing this job, that the most dangerous thing she could do was react. Not because reaction was unprofessional, though it was, but because reaction gave them something. It created a dynamic. And in that dynamic, she was always on the losing end. So she had developed instead a kind of internal processing system. She heard the thing. She acknowledged the thing internally. She filed it away in a section of her mind that she examined later, usually on the subway home, when she allowed herself 30 minutes of private feeling before she had to pick up her law textbooks and keep going. The water glasses were spotless. She'd checked them herself. She brought Elaine's water first anyway, set it down without comment, and began working the table with the quiet efficiency that had kept her employed at Crown Aurelia when others had rotated through and out. The dinner moved through its early courses without incident. The guests were the usual configuration of wealthy investment types. 2 men from a firm Sophie didn't recognize who spoke exclusively to each other in half sentences, as though full ones were a waste of energy. A silver-haired woman with a sharp smile who introduced herself as Claudette and who seemed to find the entire evening mildly amusing. 2 others whose names Sophie caught and immediately lost in the noise of managing 8 courses for 8 people simultaneously. And then Elaine, who sent her sea bass back twice, and Ethan, who ate almost nothing. She noticed the not eating because it was her job to notice. She'd refilled the table's breadbasket twice without him touching it. His appetizer plate had been cleared away largely untouched. He was drinking water and listening to— Always listening, she observed, even when he appeared to be looking elsewhere. His attention had a quality to it that she couldn't quite name. Focused, but not tense. The way someone watches a chessboard rather than a spectator sport. The documents on the table near his position were a thick stack of papers in a red folder. She'd noticed them when she set the table, as she'd been instructed. Foreign language text on the visible pages. She'd caught a glimpse of what looked like Swedish. Maybe some French mixed in. A complex header with company logos she didn't recognize. She had not touched them. She had not thought much more about them. She had other things to think about. It happened during the dessert course. Sophie was moving between the kitchen and the alcove, carrying a tray with the evening's final small plates. tiny architectural things that had taken the pastry chef 40 minutes to construct and would take the guests approximately 90 seconds to eat. She was concentrating on her balance, on the slight unevenness of the floor between the main dining room and the private alcove, a detail she had complained about to James twice and which had never been addressed. When the other server, a newer hire named Daniel, who was nervous and still hadn't found his rhythm on the floor, came around the corner from the wrong direction. They didn't collide exactly. It was more of a near miss that required Sophie to lurch sideways to avoid a full catastrophe. And in the lurch, her elbow connected with the edge of the dessert tray and a small amount of water. She'd been carrying a secondary glass to replace Elaine's, which had been requested, tipped. It was maybe a quarter cup, maybe less. It landed on the table, not on anyone, not on the documents. But it landed close, and close, for Elaine Voss, was apparently the same as direct. "Oh my God." Elaine's voice cut through the ambient sound of the restaurant with the precision of something designed specifically for cutting. Every nearby head turned. "Are you serious right now?" "I'm so sorry," Sophie said immediately, already reaching for the linen napkins. "Let me—" "Don't touch anything." Elaine stood, pushing her chair back. She was not tall, but she had the presence of someone who had spent years learning to fill more space than her physical dimensions technically required. "Do you have any idea what is on this table? Do you have any idea, any comprehension whatsoever of what those documents represent?" The water didn't— "Do not speak to me." Elaine looked at her with an expression that Sophie recognized but had never had directed at her with quite this intensity before. It was the look of someone who had just found a legitimate excuse to do something they'd been wanting to do anyway. "I want to speak to a manager, now." "Of course, I'll get— Oh, this Shabans." "Actually, wait." Elaine tilted her head. Something shifted in her expression. Less anger, more performance. She was playing to an audience now, and she knew it. The entire alcove had gone still. Ethan Vaughn was watching from the end of the table, his face unreadable. "Before you slink off, I want to ask you something." Sophie stopped. The smart thing, the professionally correct thing, the James-endorsed thing, would have been to deflect, apologize again, and retrieve the manager immediately. But something in Elaine's tone made her feet pause and her jaw set very slightly. "Do you read?" Elaine asked sweetly. Sophie looked at her. "Excuse me? It's a simple question. Can you read?" Elaine picked up one of the pages from the red folder with 2 fingers, as though it were something only marginally less distasteful than touching the waitress directly. She held it out. "Here, this document you nearly destroyed with your clumsiness. Read it to me, if you can." The room was very quiet. Sophie was aware, in a peripheral way, that this had crossed some kind of line, that this was no longer a complaint about service, that this had become something uglier and more deliberate. She was also aware that her face felt hot, which she hated, because she prided herself on control and her face was betraying her. She was also aware, in a completely separate part of her brain that had nothing to do with emotions at all, of exactly what was written on the page Elaine was holding, because she'd seen that kind of language before. She'd spent 18 months studying commercial contract law. She'd written a 40-page paper on cross-border corporate acquisition frameworks. She'd read Swedish legal documentation as part of a research project on Scandinavian real estate investment structures, which had been the most boring and also most unexpectedly useful 8 weeks of her academic life. And the clause visible on that page, she looked at it again. Really looked. Something went very cold in her chest that had nothing to do with the November temperature outside. "Go ahead," said Elaine, with a smile that didn't reach anywhere close to her eyes. "Read it, or admit you can't, and we can move on with the evening." There was a low, uncomfortable shuffle of chairs. Someone cleared their throat. One of the men from the unnamed firm looked at his hands. Claudette, the silver-haired woman, was watching Sophie with an expression that was harder to read, something between discomfort and curiosity. Ethan Vaughn said nothing. He was looking at the stack of papers remaining in the folder. Sophie reached out and took the page from Elaine's hand. She looked at it for a moment. "Clause 14, subsection B," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "In the event of a payment default or covenant breach, as defined under Section 8.2, all primary asset titles and controlling interest in the listed subsidiary entities shall be transferred automatically and irrevocably to the designated foreign holding company within 48 hours, without requirement for further negotiation or judicial review. She looked up. The table was staring at her. Elaine had stopped smiling. That's the Swedish text, Sophie continued, looking at Elaine directly. The French paragraph below it is a restatement of the same clause with slightly different language. The phrase sans recours juridique means without legal recourse. The two versions together create a cross-jurisdictional enforcement mechanism that would be extremely difficult to challenge in any single court. Silence. Complete, absolute, ringing silence. She's... One of the men from the unnamed firm started, then stopped. She's correct, said Claudette quietly from the far end of the table. Elaine's expression had gone through several things in rapid succession. Surprise, calculation, something that might have been panic but was quickly covered by a very practiced blankness. Sophie set the page back down on the table, gently, precisely where it had been. I'm sorry about the water, she said. I'll send James over immediately. She turned to leave. Wait. The voice was quiet, not loud, not sharp, just precise. The kind of voice that's accustomed to being heard without having to raise itself. She turned. Ethan Vaughn was looking at her for the first time all evening, really looking, the kind of look that was not about service or convenience, but about actual seeing. His eyes were darker than she'd registered before. There were lines around them that she hadn't noticed at distance. He looked, she thought, like someone who had been awake for a very long time. You said Clause 14, subsection B. He said it as a statement, not a question. Yes. And the cross-jurisdictional enforcement. Yes. Did you read the rest of the document? I saw it when I set the table, Sophie said carefully. I didn't read all of it. But you understand what you read. I'm a third-year law student, she said. Commercial contract law is my concentration. Another silence. Different quality this time. Sit down, he said. Elaine made a sound. Ethan, she's the waitress. Elaine. He said her name once, flatly, and the word had the effect of a door closing. He looked back at Sophie. Please, sit down. She didn't sit down. Not immediately. She looked at the empty chair he was indicating, the one that had been set for a guest who hadn't appeared, and felt a strange doubling of herself. Some version of Sophie in the wrinkled, oversized uniform, standing at the threshold of something she couldn't quite identify. I still need to get the manager, she said. About the water. The water is fine. The documents are fine. He pulled the red folder toward him and opened it flat on the table. Sit down, please. I need you to look at this. She sat down. The boardroom gravity of the moment was something she'd later struggled to describe accurately. 8 people, all with net worths that made her student loan balance look like a rounding error, watching a waitress in a safety-pinned uniform take a seat at their investment table and start reading their contract. She read it. Not quickly, not performatively. She read the way she read everything that mattered, with her full attention, tracking the language the way her professor had taught her, noting where phrasing shifted, where specificity softened into vagueness, where the apparent meaning and the technical meaning diverged. It took her 11 minutes. No one at the table spoke. Ethan sat very still beside her, watching her read, watching her expression, watching the small notations she made in the margin of the notepad she'd pulled from her server's apron without thinking. When she finished, she set the papers down. The deal is structured as a standard joint venture agreement on the surface, she said. She wasn't talking to the room. She was talking to Ethan. The primary terms, the investment percentages, the revenue sharing, the governance structure, those look reasonable. They're designed to look reasonable. They're designed to be the part you spend your time negotiating, the part your attorneys argue about in good faith, while the other side's attorneys focus elsewhere. Elsewhere being Clause 14, Ethan said. Clause 14 and also Clause 19, which is buried in the arbitration section. Clause 19 defines covenant breach in terms that are deliberately vague. It includes language about material adverse change in management structure, which is defined in Appendix C, which is written in a combination of French and Swedish legalese that is, she paused, looking for the right word, creative. The definition of material adverse change in Appendix C is broad enough that a single significant hire or termination at the executive level could theoretically trigger it. She looked around the table. If you miss a single payment deadline, or if you make a senior staffing change that someone decides qualifies as material, you lose controlling interest in every subsidiary listed in Schedule A, automatically, in 48 hours, with no recourse. The man from the unnamed firm, the one who'd started to speak earlier and stopped, was now very pale. Schedule A is the entirety of your portfolio, Ethan said. Not a question. It appears to be, Sophie said. I haven't seen your full corporate structure, but based on the list in Schedule A, it's substantial. It's everything, he said. Claudette made a low sound that wasn't quite a word. This is... Elaine stood up, her voice now carrying a different energy than it had 10 minutes ago, something sharper and more defensive. This is ridiculous. This is a waitress making accusations based on fluent Swedish and commercial contract law training, Claudette said mildly, which appears to exceed what was present at this table before her. I'd sit down, Elaine. I don't take instruction from... Sit down. Ethan's voice. Quiet, flat, final. Elaine sat. Sophie looked at the table. She was aware her hands were slightly unsteady, not from nerves exactly, but from the particular adrenaline of something that matters, something real, the way her hands used to shake before moot court arguments. She pressed them flat against the notepad. Mr. Vaughn, she said, I want to be clear about what I'm telling you and what I'm not. I've read this document once, quickly, under unusual circumstances. I could be missing something. You need your attorneys. My attorneys reviewed this document, he said. There was something in his voice that she couldn't quite identify. For 3 weeks. She looked at him. They approved it, he said. She said nothing for a moment, then carefully, then I'd suggest you need different attorneys. The dinner ended shortly after that, not with any formal announcement or dramatic gesture. Things in that world rarely ended that way. It ended the way bad investments end, with a quiet, controlled withdrawal. Ethan collected the documents. He spoke briefly to Claudette in a low voice that Sophie couldn't hear from where she'd retreated to the service station. The two men from the unnamed firm left quickly, without finishing their dessert. Elaine remained seated for several minutes after everyone else had risen, her champagne-colored dress somehow less luminous than it had been at the start of the evening. Sophie was restocking the bread station when James appeared at her elbow. What happened? He whispered. I'll explain later, she said. Did you speak to the guests? Yes. Sophie. His voice was pained. You're supposed to... I know. She looked at him. I know, James. I'll explain later. I'm sorry. He made a sound that communicated approximately 7 different emotions simultaneously and moved away. She was beginning this final table breakdown when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Ethan Vaughn standing at the entrance of the alcove. He'd put on his coat, a heavy wool thing, charcoal to match the suit. He was holding the red folder under his arm. He looked at her with the same quality of attention she'd noticed at the table, like he was solving something. I didn't catch your name, he said. Sophie Bennett. Sophie. He seemed to try the name out, not in the strange way some guests did, possessively, like using her first name established something, but in the way of someone who was memorizing it. How far along are you in law school? 3rd year? I graduate in May. Who's your contracts professor? Marlena Chu. A brief pause. I know her work, he said. She's exceptional. She is, Sophie agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the restaurant continued its end-of-service motion. Servers consolidating tables, the sound of the kitchen beginning its deep clean, the low jazz that Crown Aurelia played in the final hour before closing. I would like to offer you a consulting engagement, Ethan said. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. My office is on Park Avenue. I need the document reviewed properly. The whole thing, not just what you caught tonight. And I need it done by someone whose analysis I can trust. Sophie looked at him. There were several things she could have said. She could have said she was a student, not a licensed attorney, and that engaging her in a formal capacity raised professional questions. She could have said she had class at 11 and a shift here tomorrow evening. She could have said she was tired, that she had a contracts midterm in 4 days, that her mother's treatment was Friday and she needed to organize the payment, that she was already stretched so thin she could feel it. She said, "What's the retainer?" Something in his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, almost like surprise, except that he'd covered it before it fully arrived. "What are you expecting?" he asked. She thought about her mother's medical bills. She thought about the stack of law school tuition invoices on her desk at home. She thought about the broken zipper on her coat and the broken heater in her apartment, and the 18 months she'd been telling herself that it would get easier, and it hadn't gotten easier. $250,000, she said. Up front. The number sat in the air between them. Ethan Vaughn looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time all evening, for the first time she suspected in quite a while, one corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. "I'll have the wire transfer processed tonight," he said. Sophie took the subway home at 11:43. She sat in the corner of the car and held her bag in her lap and looked at the dark tunnel rushing past the windows and felt the specific, exhausted, electric feeling of something having shifted without yet understanding what exactly had shifted or whether it was permanent. Her phone showed 2 missed calls from her mother. She called back. "Sophie, honey, I'm fine. I just wanted to hear your voice," her mother said, which meant she wasn't entirely fine but was trying very hard not to require anything, which was a thing she'd been doing since the diagnosis and which broke Sophie's heart in a routine, daily way that she'd learned to manage but never to stop feeling. "I'm on the subway, Mom. I'll call you tomorrow morning before your appointment." "You sound different." "I'm tired." "No, it's different than tired." A pause. The particular silence of her mother thinking. "Something happened?" "Maybe," Sophie said. "I'll tell you about it when I know what to tell." She hung up and looked at the tunnel again. She thought about Ethan Vaughn's face when she'd quoted the retainer. She'd expected him to negotiate. She'd expected him to look at her, this waitress in a safety-pinned uniform, this nobody, and offer a fraction and assume she'd take it gratefully. She'd chosen the number specifically because it felt impossible, because she'd decided that if he was going to engage her, it would be on terms that meant something, terms that acknowledged what she'd just done in that room. He hadn't negotiated. She didn't know what to do with that. She also didn't know what to do with the fact that when he'd looked at her, really looked, for the first time, at the table, she'd seen something she hadn't expected to see in someone like him. Not arrogance, not assessment, not the calculating look of a man pricing a new acquisition, just tiredness. A deep, very private exhaustion, the kind that people who are accustomed to managing everything very competently alone carry around in the lines of their faces and the set of their shoulders. She recognized it because she saw it every morning in the mirror above the lockers. She got off the subway and walked the 4 blocks home in the November cold, her broken zippered coat open at the neck, and climbed 4 flights of stairs to her apartment, where the heat still wasn't working. She sat at her desk. She opened her contracts textbook. She had a midterm in 4 days, a shift tomorrow evening, a 9 o'clock meeting at a Park Avenue skyscraper, and a mother who needed her to hold it together. She opened to Chapter 14, Cross-Border Commercial Agreements and Jurisdiction, and began to read. Outside, Manhattan kept going. The Crown Aurelia closed its carved wooden door for the night. The brass plate caught the light from a passing cab and briefly gleamed. Somewhere in Midtown, in an office on a high floor with a view of the city laid out like a map, a man in a charcoal suit sat at a desk and looked at a red folder. He had a daughter who was 7 years old and who was being watched by her nanny tonight and who had left him a voicemail at 6:15 asking when he was coming home that he hadn't been able to listen to yet because if he listened to it in the restaurant, he wouldn't have been able to keep his face right. He listened to it now. "Daddy, Marta made pasta, and it's the wrong kind again. I told her you like the one with the ridges, but she keeps buying the flat one. Also, I drew you a picture. It's of a dog even though we don't have a dog. I just wanted to draw one. Come home, okay? Come home soon." He set the phone down. He looked at the red folder for a long time. Then he opened his laptop and initiated a wire transfer for $250,000 to an account he'd found by cross-referencing the name Sophie Bennett with the City Bar's student registration system. Because he was thorough, because he was always thorough, and because something in the way she'd said that number, steadily, clearly, like she'd already decided, had told him that she'd spend it on something that mattered. He hit confirm. He closed the laptop. He thought about going home. He thought about tomorrow. He thought, briefly and without intending to, about a woman in a safety-pinned uniform who spoke Swedish and French, and saw in 11 minutes what 3 weeks of expensive attorneys had missed. Then he picked up his phone and called his daughter back. The wire transfer confirmation arrived at 6:47 in the morning. Sophie had been awake for 40 minutes, sitting at her desk in 2 sweaters with a mug of coffee that had gone cold, working through a practice exam when her phone buzzed. She almost ignored it. She was in the middle of a particularly aggressive hypothetical about implied warranties, and she'd learned, through painful experience, to not break her concentration mid-problem. But something made her look. The notification was from her bank. She opened it, read it once, read it again, set the phone face down on the desk, picked it up and read it a third time, because the number on the screen was not a number she had ever seen associated with her name before, and her brain kept trying to correct it into something more familiar, something that made sense within the architecture of her normal life. $250,000. It was there. It was real. It had arrived at 11:58 the previous night, while she was sitting in this exact chair reading about cross-border jurisdiction frameworks, which felt like the kind of coincidence that wasn't a coincidence at all, but just life being occasionally grimly literal. She put the phone down again. She looked at the ceiling for a while. Then she picked up her pen and finished the practice exam, because she had a midterm in 4 days and the money, however real, did not change that fact. Nothing about her changed overnight. That was something she'd learned early. Circumstances could shift without warning, but you still had to show up to the thing in front of you, and the thing in front of her was a 40-point hypothetical about implied warranties, and she was going to finish it. She did finish it. Then she showered in water that took 3 minutes to get warm, dressed in the most professional thing she owned. A navy blazer she'd bought secondhand and had dry cleaned exactly twice, dark slacks, a white blouse she'd ironed the night before, and stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom. She looked at herself. She looked like someone trying to look like a lawyer, which she was, which she supposed was the best she could do right now. She picked up her bag, made sure she had her notepad and 3 pens, and went out into the cold. The subway was crowded at 8:15, the morning rush in full compression, everyone pressed together with the particular New York intimacy of people who are physically close and emotionally nowhere near each other. Sophie stood holding the overhead bar and reviewed, in her head, what she'd read the previous night after the restaurant. She'd pulled up every reference she could find on cross-jurisdictional asset transfer clauses and joint venture agreements. She'd gone back through her Professor Marlena Chu's published work on covenant breach definitions. She'd made 8 pages of notes by hand because she always retained things better when she wrote them by hand, a habit from undergrad that her law school study group found mildly eccentric. She was not, she reminded herself, a licensed attorney. She was a third-year student. Whatever happened in that office today, she needed to be precise about the boundaries of what she was and wasn't qualified to say. She could read the document. She could flag what she saw. She could not provide formal legal counsel, and she needed to say that clearly, up front, before anyone had the chance to misunderstand what she was there to do. She also needed to not be intimidated. She was, preemptively, already a little intimidated. The Vaughn Capitol building on Park Avenue was 43 stories of glass and steel that managed to be simultaneously understated and overwhelming. The architectural equivalent of a person who is very quietly confident that they're the most important person in the room. The lobby was marble and warm lighting, and a security desk staffed by 2 men who looked at Sophie with the professional blankness of people trained to assess and not show the assessment. She gave her name. One of them made a call, a pause. Then, 41st floor, Ms. Reyes will meet you at the elevator. Ms. Reyes turned out to be a woman in her mid-40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the manner of someone who ran 7 things simultaneously and was completely at peace with that. She shook Sophie's hand briskly. Sophie Bennett, I'm Andrea, Mr. Vaughn's chief of staff. She was already moving toward a conference room as she spoke, and Sophie fell into step beside her. He's on a call until 9, which gives us 15 minutes. Coffee? Please. Milk, sugar? Black. Sensible. Andrea pushed open a glass door into a conference room that was roughly the size of Sophie's entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Park Avenue. The table could have seated 20. Someone had placed the red folder at one end, along with what appeared to be a second, thicker stack of documents Sophie hadn't seen before. The original contract is in the red folder, Andrea said, setting a coffee in front of Sophie with the efficient grace of someone who had done this 10,000 times. The supplementary materials, the appendices, the schedule of breakdown, correspondence with the foreign investors are in the blue stack. Mr. Vaughn would like your full assessment, whatever you saw last night plus anything else. Sophie looked at the stack. I should be upfront about something, Sophie said. I'm not a licensed attorney. I'm a third-year law student. I can review this and tell you what I find, but I can't provide formal legal counsel, and anything I flag should be reviewed by a qualified attorney before any action is taken. Andrea looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile. I know exactly what you are, she said. So does Mr. Vaughn. That's why you're here. She left Sophie alone with the documents and the coffee and the 41st floor view of Park Avenue going about its morning. Sophie opened the red folder. She began to read. Yem. She'd been at it for 35 minutes when she heard the door open behind her. She didn't look up. She was in the middle of Appendix C, the one with the creative definition of material adverse change, and she'd found 3 additional subclauses she hadn't caught the previous night, each one progressively more buried and more aggressive in its implications. She finished the paragraph she was on and made a note before turning around. Ethan Vaughn looked like he'd slept about as much as she had, which was to say, not enough. The same charcoal precision as the night before, but with the slightly compressed quality of a man who had been dealing with something since before dawn. He was carrying his own coffee and had his phone in his other hand, which he silenced and pocketed when he came in. How long have you been here? He asked. About 40 minutes. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, not at the head of the table, directly across, which she noted. What have you found? 3 things you didn't know about last night, she said, and confirmation of the 2 things you did. He leaned forward slightly. Go. Sophie turned her notepad toward him. She'd drawn a rough structural map of the contract, the visible architecture at the top, the hidden mechanisms below, arrows connecting clauses to appendices to schedules. It was messy and earnest and looked exactly like what it was. A law student's working notes, not a polished legal brief. The main trap is still Clause 14 in Appendix C, she said, but there are supporting structures. Clause 22, it's in the arbitration section, which is where people stop reading carefully. Clause 22 specifies that all disputes must be resolved through a particular arbitration panel in Stockholm. That panel is, she flipped to a page she'd marked, named in Appendix F, which lists 3 individuals. I looked 2 of them up this morning. Both have prior affiliations with one of the foreign investment entities listed in Schedule A. Ethan was quiet for a moment. The arbitrators are connected to the investors. I can't prove that definitively without more research, but the connections are there and they're not disclosed anywhere in this document. And the third thing? The payment schedule. She turned another page. The deal specifies quarterly payments, which looks standard, but the payment dates are defined in Appendix B using a European banking calendar, not the U.S. calendar. There are 3 dates in the first year where the European and U.S. calendars diverge by 1 business day. If your payment processing is set up on a U.S. calendar, which it would be because you're a U.S.-based company, you would be technically 1 day late on those 3 payments. She looked at him. He'd gone very still. 1 day late triggers the covenant breach definition, she said, which triggers Clause 14. A silence that had weight to it. The payment schedule was designed to fail, he said. It was designed to appear to fail, she said. Technically, under the contract's own terms, you would be in breach. Whether that was intentional on the part of the drafting attorneys or a... She paused. Creative oversight, I can't say. Ethan set his coffee down. He looked at the structural map on her notepad. He was quiet for long enough that Sophie began to wonder whether she'd misjudged something, whether she'd overstepped in a way she couldn't read yet. My legal team, he said finally. 3 senior partners, 15 years of collective experience in commercial real estate transactions. They had this document for 3 weeks. I know. And they approved it. I know, she said again. Which means either they're incompetent or they didn't read it carefully or... He stopped. Sophie said nothing. She wasn't going to finish that sentence for him. It wasn't her sentence to finish. He picked up his coffee again. Or something else, he said quietly, and the way he said it told her he'd already been sitting with the something else possibility since at least last night, probably since before that. I think, Sophie said carefully, that you should engage outside counsel to review this. Independent, no connection to your current legal team or to any of the parties in the deal. I'm planning to, he said. You're going to help me do that, today. She blinked. Today. The investors want a signed contract by end of week. I need to either renegotiate the terms or walk away. And I need enough documented analysis to do either one intelligently. He looked at her across the table. You're going to stay and work through this with me and whoever I bring in. If that's a problem, tell me now. Sophie thought about her 11 o'clock class. She thought about Professor Chu's lecture on remedies that she'd been planning to attend. She thought about her midterm. I have one condition, she said. What? I need to step out at 2 o'clock for 45 minutes, non-negotiable. He looked at her. What for? Personal reasons. She could see him calculating, the same way she'd seen him calculating at the restaurant. Quick and complete, reaching a conclusion without making a production of it. Fine, he said, 2 o'clock. Then I can stay. What followed was 6 hours that Sophie would later describe to her mother as the most exhausting and educational experience of my life, possibly including law school itself, which was saying something because law school had included Marlena Chu's first-year contract's final, which had hospitalized 2 students with stress-induced migraines. Ethan made calls. People appeared. A woman named Diane, who was apparently the most aggressively competent paralegal in Midtown, arrived with 3 additional attorneys. Not Ethan's regular firm, but people he clearly trusted because the manner in which he briefed them was direct and without performance. He told them what had happened at the restaurant. He told them what Sophie had found this morning. He used the word she and pointed to Sophie without any preamble or explanation, and the 3 attorneys looked at Sophie, a young woman in a second-hand blazer with handwritten notes on a legal pad, and recalibrated visibly in real time. One of them, a man named Hector, who had the compact energy of someone perpetually on the verge of an objection, asked her to walk him through her analysis of Clause 22. She did. He listened. He asked 2 sharp follow-up questions. She answered them. He turned to Ethan and said, "She's right about the arbitration panel." After that, no one questioned her presence. The work was not glamorous. It was the opposite of glamorous. It was the kind of detailed, painstaking document review that law students and junior associates do at midnight in windowless offices. The kind of work that requires sustained focus and a tolerance for fine print and the ability to hold 10 separate clauses in your head simultaneously while checking each one against the others for internal consistency. Sophie was good at it. She'd always been good at it, in the particular way that people are good at things they've had to be good at because no one was going to do it for them. She worked through the contract section by section with Hector and one of the other attorneys while Diane, the paralegal, cross-referenced everything against a database of precedent cases. And Ethan moved in and out of the room, phone calls, conversations in the hallway, a brief disappearance that lasted 20 minutes during which Andrea appeared with sandwiches and fruit that no one had ordered. Sophie ate half a sandwich without tasting it, made 6 more pages of notes, and flagged 2 additional issues she'd missed in her morning review. At one point, Hector looked up from his own marked copy and said, "Where did you say you go to school?" "Columbia," Sophie said. "Who's your advisor?" "Marlena Chu." Hector made a sound that might have been respect. "She was 2 years ahead of me at Harvard," he said. "Terrifying in moot court." "She's still terrifying," Sophie said. "Good," said Hector, and went back to reading. At 1:52, she gathered her things and went to find Andrea. "I need to step out for 45 minutes, she said. "I'll be back by 2:45. Andrea didn't question it. She handed Sophie a visitor badge for re-entry and pointed her to the elevator. Sophie walked 4 blocks north in the cold to a pharmacy, where she stood in line for 8 minutes and then bought 3 things: a card, a small box of the specific chocolate her mother liked, and a calling card for international calls that she didn't need but bought anyway because the line was long and she was thinking about other things. She stood on the sidewalk outside the pharmacy and called her mother. "I'm outside your treatment center," she said when her mother picked up. "I can't come in today, but I wanted to call while you were there." "Sophie, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She looked at the street, people moving in every direction with that particular New York momentum, everyone going somewhere, everyone late. "How are you feeling?" "Tired. But the good nurse is here today, the one with the green earrings. She always talks to me about her garden. Good. Sophie's throat did something she didn't allow it to finish. Mom, I need to tell you something. What happened? I'm not sure yet. I don't want to promise anything, but I think the medical bills are going to be okay. The treatment bills. I think I can cover them. Silence. Sophie, I took on a consulting job. It's real, it's legitimate, and Mom, it's going to be okay. I think it's going to be okay. Her mother made a sound that Sophie had heard before and hoped she'd never have to hear again because it was the sound of someone who had been holding something for a very long time and had just been told, maybe, that they could put it down for a minute. Tell me everything, her mother said. I can't right now. I have to go back. Then tonight. Tonight, Sophie agreed. I promise. She hung up and stood on the sidewalk for exactly 30 seconds, doing nothing, letting the cold do what cold does. Then she turned around and walked back to the Vaughn Capitol building. Arsham. She was back in the conference room at 2:41. Ethan was there. The others had stepped out, and he was alone at the table with a printed summary that Diane had apparently produced while Sophie was gone. A neat condensation of everything they'd found, formatted with the professional precision that Sophie's handwritten notes were emphatically not. He looked up when she came in. Everything okay? He asked. Fine, she said, sitting back down and pulling her notepad toward her. Where are we? He watched her for a moment before answering. Not intrusively. There was nothing intrusive about it. It was the same quality of attention she'd noticed at the restaurant, the same thing she'd thought about on the subway, about the particular exhaustion in people who carry things alone for a long time. We've identified 7 separate problematic provisions, he said. Hector thinks we have enough to go back to the investors and demand a complete renegotiation, or we walk. Are you going to walk? I don't know yet. He turned the printed summary toward her. What do you think? She looked at him across the table. He was asking her genuinely, not rhetorically, not performatively. He actually wanted to know what she thought. I think the deal was never a deal, she said. It was an acquisition dressed up as a partnership. If you renegotiate, you're negotiating with people who built a trap and are now surprised you found it. They're not going to bargain in good faith. So walk. That's my read. But I don't know your business the way you do. I don't know what this deal was supposed to accomplish or what you lose by walking away from it. Time, he said. Primarily. The expansion I was planning to fund with this would take another 18 months to finance through other channels. Is 18 months worse than losing everything in Schedule A? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Then walk, she said. He nodded slowly. Not like she'd told him something new, exactly. More like she'd said out loud the thing he'd been moving toward since last night, and it sounded different hearing it from outside his own head. The door opened and Hector and the others came back in, and the afternoon shifted back into the work, into clauses and subclauses, and the careful architecture of disengaging from a deal that had been designed to be very difficult to disengage from. Sophie worked through it with them, checking Hector's reasoning against her own, noting the places where they agreed and the 2 places where they didn't, making her case on the second one clearly enough that Hector changed his position and told her, without apparent ego, that she'd been right. By 5 o'clock, they had a complete analysis, a draft termination letter, and a strategy for the conversation with the foreign investors that Ethan was going to have. Hector and his team packed up and left, exchanging cards and murmured consultation about follow-up. Diane followed, efficient to the last. Andrea came in to collect the coffee cups. And then it was just Ethan and Sophie and the stack of documents and the November dark settling outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked tired. Not the performed tiredness of busy people who want credit for being busy, but the real kind. The kind that lives behind the eyes. Thank you, he said. What you did last night, and today, I want to be clear that I understand what it meant. You paid me, Sophie said. I paid you what you asked for, he said. Those are different things. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she didn't do anything, just began organizing her notes into a stack that she would take home and file away, because she was thorough and because you never knew. Can I ask you something? He said. She looked up. Last night, when Elaine handed you that page, He paused, like he was choosing how to say the next part. You could have just read it and moved on. You could have read it and not said anything. Why did you say something? Sophie thought about it honestly. I almost didn't, she said. What made you? I looked at you, she said, and you looked like someone who was about to make a very expensive mistake without knowing it. And She stopped, looked at her notes. I don't know. I couldn't not say anything. It's probably a character flaw. He almost laughed. It wasn't quite a laugh. It was the cousin of one, the shape of it without the sound. But it changed his face briefly into something younger and less guarded, and she caught it before it went away. How's your mother? He said. Sophie went still. What? You said you needed to step out at 2. Andrea told me where you went. He held up a hand. That's not overstepping. I asked her. I wanted to know if everything was okay. My mother is fine, Sophie said carefully. She's in treatment. I'm not trying to know your business, he said. I wanted to say that if the retainer doesn't cover everything, you can invoice me for additional consulting hours. We have more work to do on this deal before it's fully unwound. And after that, if you're interested, Hector's firm takes on associates occasionally. I can make a call. Sophie looked at him. I don't need favors, she said. It's not a favor, he said. It's a referral. There's a difference. They looked at each other across the conference table, across the remnants of a very long day, across the particular awkward distance of two people who don't quite know what the other one is yet. I'll think about the additional hours, she said finally. Good. She gathered her things. He walked her to the elevator, which she hadn't expected. It was such a small, old-fashioned gesture that it caught her off guard. They stood in the hallway waiting for it, and she became aware of how quiet the 41st floor was at 5 in the evening, how the ambient sound of the city came up through the windows as a low, distant presence. What made you go to law school? He asked. Not making conversation, actually asking. My mother got sick my first year of undergrad, she said. We had a problem with the insurance company. Denial of coverage. I spent 6 months trying to fight it, and I kept running into this wall of language. Contracts, policy exclusions, terms I couldn't understand. By the time I figured it out enough to fight back, we'd lost 8 months of treatment. She looked at the elevator doors. I didn't want to not know things anymore. Quiet. That's a good reason, he said. The elevator arrived. She got in, turned around. He was standing in the hallway with his hands in his pockets, still with that quality of watching that she was starting to find less unnerving and more like something she didn't quite have a word for yet. Good luck with your investors, she said. Good luck with your midterm, he said. The doors closed. She descended 41 floors alone, watching the numbers drop, and tried to figure out what exactly was sitting in her chest. Not the money, though the money was still there, still strange and real. Not the work, though the work had been good, the kind that reminded her why she'd chosen any of this. Something else. Something she wasn't going to name yet because naming things made them real, and she was not ready for it to be real. The lobby doors opened, and the November air hit her full in the face, cold and immediate, and thoroughly uninterested in whatever she was feeling. She pulled her broken zippered coat closed with one hand and walked toward the subway. She called her mother. Okay, she said when her mother picked up. I have 45 minutes before my train. Tell me about the nurse with the green earrings, and then I'll tell you everything. Her mother laughed. A real one, tired but real. And Sophie walked down into the underground, into the warm and rumbling dark. And for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, she talked without measuring every word first. The midterm was on a Thursday. Sophie arrived 20 minutes early, which was her habit, and sat in the second row, which was also her habit, and arranged her pens in the order she always arranged them, black, blue, red, and then sat very still for a while, doing nothing, which was not her habit at all. She was thinking about a payment schedule designed to fail, not because it was on the exam. It wasn't. It couldn't be. No one outside of a Park Avenue conference room and a private investment dinner knew about it. But the mechanism of it kept surfacing in her mind at odd moments, the elegant cruelty of building a trap into the calendar, into something as mundane and invisible as the difference between a European banking day and an American one. The assumption that no one would look closely enough. The confidence, on the part of whoever had drafted that contract, that the people across the table would be too distracted by the visible terms to notice what was moving underneath. She thought about that kind of confidence, what it required of the person who had it. Then the proctor said, "You may begin," and Sophie picked up her black pen and stopped thinking about anything except the exam. She finished with 12 minutes to spare, reviewed her answers once, caught one error in her analysis of a promissory estoppel question, corrected it, and handed in the paper. She walked out into the hallway where several of her classmates were standing in the particular post-exam cluster of people who need to immediately process what they've just experienced with other people who've just experienced the same thing. "How was it?" her study partner Marcus asked. He was a tall man from Atlanta who wore bow ties unironically and had the best memory for case citations of anyone in their cohort. "Fine," Sophie said. "Fine like actually fine, or fine like you're in shock?" "Fine like actually fine." He looked at her with mild suspicion. "The promissory estoppel question got me." "The date sequence," she said. "It's about the date sequence, not the promise itself." He made a sound of profound regret. "I know that now." She patted his arm and kept walking, because she had a shift at Crown Aurelia at 7, and she needed to eat something before then, and eating required going home first, and going home required the subway, and none of it was going to happen if she stood in the hallway talking about an exam that was already over. She ate leftover rice and vegetable soup standing over her kitchen sink, because the table was covered in textbooks, and she hadn't cleared it in 3 days. She changed into her uniform. She repinned the safety pins at her hip. She stood in front of the mirror and thought, not for the first time, that she should just buy a new uniform, that she could technically afford one now, that there was no good reason to keep wearing a garment that required safety pins. She didn't, though. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because buying a new uniform would mean something she wasn't ready for it to mean. Some acknowledgement that this was still her life, that the money in her bank account and the day on the 41st floor were things that had happened to this person, this waitress in this apartment, and not to some other version of herself she hadn't become yet. She went to work. James greeted her at the service entrance with an expression she recognized as his "we need to discuss something" face, which was distinct from his "something has gone wrong on the floor" face and his "a guest has complained" face, though all three shared a common quality of controlled apprehension. "The investors from last week's dinner called the restaurant," he said, before she'd finished hanging up her coat. Sophie turned. "Which investors?" "The ones with the red folder." He was keeping his voice low, though the kitchen corridor was empty. "They spoke to management. They said there was an incident involving a server who improperly interfered in a private business negotiation and shared confidential document content with an unauthorized party." She stared at him. "They're asking for the server to be identified," James said. "James, I didn't tell them anything." He said it quickly, firmly. "I told management it was a service incident involving a water spill and that it had been resolved and that I had no information about any other interaction, which is technically the truth, because you still haven't told me exactly what happened." She looked at him. James had worked at Crown Aurelia for 11 years. He had hired her when she'd come in with a resume that listed a diner in Queens and a coffee shop in Brooklyn and nothing else. And he'd given her the job because, he'd told her afterward, she was the only one who'd ask questions about the menu, instead of about the tip structure. He was not the warmest person she'd ever known, but he was fair, and that counted for more than warmth most of the time. "The investors were defrauding one of the guests," she said. "The contract had hidden provisions that would have transferred all his assets without his knowledge. I read it and told him." James was quiet for a moment. "You read it." "I'm in law school, James." "I know you're in law school," he said, with the tone of a man reassembling his understanding of a situation he thought he'd understood. Did Mr. Vaughn know what you'd done?" "He hired me," she said, "to consult on it. I worked at his offices Tuesday." Another silence, longer this time. "And the $250,000, she said, because she could see him about to ask, is a consulting retainer. It's legitimate. I can document all of it." James looked at her for a very long moment. Then he straightened his jacket, which was his tell, the physical action he performed when he was filing something away and moving on. "The investors called the restaurant," he said, "because they want leverage. They don't have any. Whatever they told management, management has no interest in losing a client like Ethan Vaughn over a complaint from people he apparently just terminated a deal with. He paused. You're not in trouble, but I thought you should know. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. Go check table 3. They've been waiting 12 minutes for their appetizers. She went. She didn't hear from Ethan for 9 days, which was fine, which was exactly as it should be. He'd paid her for a specific engagement. The engagement was complete, and there was no particular reason he should be in contact afterward. She told herself this in a clear and reasonable way on the 3rd day, less clearly on the 5th, and with considerably less conviction by the 8th. On the 9th day, Andrea called. Mr. Vaughn would like to know if you're available Thursday afternoon, she said, with the brisk efficiency of someone who made 12 of these calls a day and treated each one identically. He's meeting with the investors to formally close out the deal terms. He'd like you present. Sophie had a study session with Marcus on Thursday afternoon. She rescheduled it. 2 o'clock, Andrea said. And Sophie, he said to tell you there's no exam you need to reschedule this time. She almost smiled. Tell him I only had 1 midterm this semester. I'll pass that along. The meeting with the investors was not at Vaughn Capital. It was at a neutral law office in a building on Lexington Avenue, in a conference room that had clearly been chosen for its impersonality. Beige walls, generic art, the kind of space designed to belong to no one. Sophie arrived at the same time as Ethan, which was not planned, but they met in the lobby and rode the elevator up together. And in the close quarters of the elevator, she noticed that he was carrying a coffee from the same place she'd stopped on the way, the unremarkable deli on 47th that had the best drip coffee in the neighborhood, and that he looked, if not rested, at least less like someone running on fumes and adrenaline than he had 9 days ago. How was the midterm? He asked. Fine, she said. Fine, like actually fine? She looked at him. Someone else asked me that exact question. And? Fine, like actually fine, she said. The elevator opened. They walked out into the beige conference room hallway, and Sophie realized with a small interior jolt that she had just had a completely normal exchange with a billionaire in an elevator without performing any part of it, without being careful, without managing anything. She wasn't sure when that had happened. The investors were already in the conference room. There were 4 of them today. 2 Sophie recognized from the dinner, 2 she didn't. No Elaine. Sophie noted the absence and filed it without comment. Hector was there, along with one of the attorneys from the Tuesday session. They nodded at Sophie with the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of people who had established a professional footing and were comfortable with it. The lead investor was a man named Henrik, tall, silver-haired, with the measured manner of someone who was accustomed to having the upper hand in rooms and was recalibrating in real time to the fact that he did not have it here. He looked at Sophie when she sat down. A brief assessment, quickly neutral. Ms. Bennett, he said, acknowledging her directly, which told her he'd done his research in the 9 days since the dinner. Mr. Henrique, she said. Ethan sat at the head of the table. He opened the meeting without preamble, without pleasantries. We're here to formally terminate the agreement under Section 18.1, mutual withdrawal prior to execution. I've had the termination letter drafted. It's in front of you. Henrik looked at the letter. His attorney, a compact woman who'd said nothing yet, looked at it too. We're prepared to discuss amended terms, Henrik said. I'm not, Ethan said. There were drafting errors in the original document. We acknowledge that. A revised version could... Henrik. Ethan's voice was quiet, the same quality as when he'd said Elaine's name at the dinner. 1 word, closing a door. The errors weren't drafting errors. We both know that. I'm not going to sit in this room and have a conversation where we both pretend otherwise. Sign the termination letter or don't. If you don't, we'll proceed through the arbitration clause, the one with the undisclosed panel affiliations, which I'm prepared to file a formal complaint about with the relevant bar associations in both jurisdictions. The compact attorney looked up sharply. Henrik was quiet for a long moment. Sophie watched him. She watched the calculation moving behind his eyes. The same calculation she'd seen in people before, the moment when someone decides whether the fight is worth the cost. It usually wasn't once the element of surprise was gone. Traps only work once. He picked up the pen. He signed the termination letter. His attorney signed the witness line. Ethan collected the document, passed it to Hector, and stood. "Thank you for your time," he said, with the polished neutrality of a man who has won something and is not going to make a spectacle of it. That was it. 23 minutes, start to finish. In the elevator on the way down, Sophie realized her hands were completely steady. She'd expected them to shake, the way they had in the restaurant, the particular physical response to things that mattered. But they were still. "You didn't flinch?" Ethan said. "Neither did you." "I've been doing this longer," he paused. "You were good in there." "I didn't say anything in there." "You didn't need to." He looked at the elevator doors. "Presence is half of it. Knowing you're in the room changes the dynamic. Henrik knew what you'd found. He knew you were going to be watching for anything he tried." He glanced at her. "That's not nothing." She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Hector called her the following week. "This is not entirely social," he said, which was how she suspected Hector opened most calls. "Ethan mentioned that you're finishing law school in May." "That's right. We have a position opening up in June. Junior associate, commercial transactions focus. Normally we recruit through the usual channels, but Ethan suggested I call you directly." A pause. "I want to be clear that this isn't charity and it isn't a favor. I watched you work for 6 hours. I don't offer positions to people who aren't qualified, but I also don't usually recruit this informally, so I want to make sure you understand that it's a real offer and not—" "I understand," Sophie said. "Do you want to come in and talk about it?" "Yes," she said. "I do." She hung up and sat at her kitchen table for a full minute before she did anything else. The textbooks were still stacked on one end, because she still hadn't cleared them, but she'd been making small progress. One corner of the table was visible now. The wood surface she'd forgotten was a warm, dark brown. She called her mother. "The medical bills," she said, and her voice did the thing she hadn't let it do in a long time, that slight, uncertain quality, like the sentence was more fragile than she'd expected. "I paid them. All of them. I paid the last one this morning." The silence on the other end of the line was the particular kind that has shape and weight. "Sophie," her mother said, "all of them, Mom." Her mother made the sound again. The one from the sidewalk outside the pharmacy. The one that meant something being put down. And this time, Sophie let it wash over her instead of pushing through it, because she'd earned the right to hear it, because they'd both earned the right to this specific moment. "Now tell me about the job," her mother said finally, in a voice that was trying very hard to be practical and not quite making it. Sophie told her. It was a Sunday afternoon in December when she ran into Ethan somewhere that wasn't a conference room for the first time. She was in a park on the Upper West Side. Not her neighborhood, but she'd come up to visit a law school friend who lived near the museum, and afterward she'd decided to walk instead of taking the subway because the cold had gone clean and dry rather than bitter. The kind of December day that actually felt like a gift instead of a punishment. She heard a child's voice before she saw them. "No, like this. You have to lean into it or you'll fall." She looked toward the sound. A little girl, 7 or 8, small and serious-faced with dark curls escaping from a blue wool hat, was on a scooter, navigating the path with the concentration of someone performing surgery. A few feet behind her, Ethan Vaughn was walking with his hands in his coat pockets, wearing the expression of someone who is trying to look relaxed and is about 70% succeeding. Sophie stopped. He saw her at approximately the same moment. They both stood there for a half-second with the particular human awkwardness of encountering someone from one context inside a completely different one, where none of the professional scaffolding applies, and you're just two people on a path in a park. "Hi," said Sophie. "Hi," said Ethan. The little girl, apparently not interested in whatever was happening between the two adults, executed a careful turn on her scooter and came back toward them. "Daddy, I did the turn." "I saw," he said. He looked at Sophie. "This is my daughter, Mia." He looked at Mia. "This is Sophie. She works with me sometimes." Mia looked at Sophie with the frank assessment that children bring to adults before they've learned to soften it. "Do you have a scooter?" "I don't," Sophie said. "You should get one. They're faster than walking." She considered this. "Are you cold? Your coat is open." Sophie looked down. The zipper. She'd meant to fix it. She'd been meaning to fix it for months. She hadn't. It's broken, she said. Mia frowned with the seriousness of someone identifying an engineering problem. Daddy knows how to fix zippers. Mia, Ethan said. He does. He fixed mine twice. She seemed to find Sophie's zipper situation genuinely concerning. You should ask him. Mia. His voice had a shade of something in it that might have been embarrassment, which was the last thing Sophie expected to see on his face, and which made him look briefly like a person rather than an institution. I'll manage, Sophie said. She looked at Mia. Nice scooter work, though. The turn was good. Mia accepted this seriously. I'm still working on the backward stop. She scooted off again down the path, focused. Ethan and Sophie were left standing side by side, watching her. She's great, Sophie said. She's exhausting, he said. In the best way. He paused. I didn't know you came up to this neighborhood. I don't usually. I was visiting a friend. She watched Mia navigate around a dog walker with professional composure. She's confident. She wasn't always, he said. She was very... He stopped, then started again. She went through a period where she didn't want to try new things. After her mother died, she was 4. She spent about a year not wanting to try anything that she might fail at. He said it straightforwardly, without the careful framing people usually put around that kind of information. The scooter was a big deal when she finally agreed to try it. Sophie was quiet for a moment. She wasn't sure what to say, and she didn't want to say the wrong thing, the automatic condolence phrase that people offer when they don't know what else to do. How old is she now? She asked. 7, almost 8. He paused. She tells everyone she's almost 8, has been doing it since she turned 7. Classic, Sophie said. They walked a few steps in the same direction, following Mia at a distance, not really deciding to do it, but ending up doing it anyway. Hector called me, Sophie said, about the position. I heard. He kept his eyes on Mia. Are you going to take it? I'm thinking about it. What's to think about? She looked at him sidelong. I don't want to take a job because you made a call, she said. I want to take it because I'm qualified, and they actually want me there. I made the call to get Hector to call you, he said. I didn't make the call to get him to offer you the job. He makes his own offers. Ask anyone who's tried to push a hire on him. She considered this. He did say it wasn't charity. He says that to everyone. It's practically his opening line. A small pause. Mia had reached the end of the path and was turning around, and they both watched her land the turn with slightly better form than the last one. I'll probably take it, Sophie said. Good, he said. They kept walking. It wasn't awkward exactly, or it was awkward in the specific way of two people who are both aware of something that neither of them is going to name right now, because the naming would change things before either of them is sure what things they want changed. Mia came back to them at speed and executed a stop that was slightly less controlled than she'd intended, grabbing Sophie's arm for balance. Sorry, she said very seriously. No problem, Sophie said. The stop needs work. Mia's eyes lit up with the pleasure of someone who has been given a real assessment instead of a polite one. I know. I'm working on it. She looked at her father. Can Sophie walk with us to the hot chocolate place? Ethan looked at Sophie with an expression that contained somewhere in it a question that was not about hot chocolate. Sophie thought about her subway card and the reading she'd planned for this evening and the 4 things on her to-do list that she'd been carrying forward for 3 days without addressing. Okay, she said, but I have to leave by 5. The hot chocolate place is 10 minutes, Mia said with great authority. We go every Sunday. It's not fancy, but it's the best one. They walked. The hot chocolate place was a narrow cafe that smelled like coffee and butter and old wood, the kind of place that doesn't try to be anything other than what it is. They sat at a small table near the window, Mia and Ethan on one side, Sophie on the other, which meant Sophie ended up facing the street with a view of December light going golden and then flat over the park. Mia ordered a hot chocolate and then immediately began explaining in great detail her current project at school, which involved building a model of an ecosystem and had encountered several setbacks related to what she called the glue situation. The moss wouldn't stick, she said. I tried 3 different kinds of glue. Marcus at school said I should use tape, but tape shows. What about rubber cement? Sophie asked. Mia frowned. What's that? It's a kind of glue. Strong, dries mostly clear. People use it for things like moss because it's flexible. She thought about it. We used it in an art class in 4th grade. I don't know if they still sell it. Mia turned to her father. Can we look? We can look, he said. Sophie, are you good at art? No, Sophie said honestly. I'm bad at anything that requires being steady with my hands. Mia found this surprising. But you write a lot. I saw your notes when Daddy showed me your notes. She turned to Ethan. I asked to see, and he showed me the ones with the map. Sophie looked at Ethan. He had the expression of someone who had not anticipated this particular conversational development. You showed her my notes? Sophie said. She asked what I was working on, he said, with the slightly defensive tone of a man caught in something minor. I showed her the structural map. She thought it looked like a treasure map. It does look like a treasure map, Mia confirmed. Sophie looked at Mia. It's a contract map. I was showing your dad where the problems were hidden in a document. Mia's eyes widened with genuine interest. Like traps? Kind of like traps, yes. And you found them? I found most of them. Mia considered this with the gravity it deserved. That's a good job, she decided. Thank you, Sophie said. The hot chocolates arrived. Mia's had whipped cream, which she immediately began managing with great concentration. Ethan wrapped both hands around his mug and looked out the window briefly, and Sophie caught his expression in the reflection. A softness that she suspected he didn't often allow where anyone could see it. The look of a man who was sitting in a warm cafe with his daughter, and someone he hadn't expected to be sitting here with, and finding the combination unexpectedly bearable. She looked away before he turned back. Your mother, Ethan said, low, while Mia was absorbed in the whipped cream. How is she doing? Better, Sophie said. The last scan was good. Not perfect. They're cautiously optimistic, which is the medical way of saying they're not ready to celebrate, but they're not worried either. That's good. It is. She turned her mug in her hands. She keeps asking about my job. She wants me to have a job that doesn't involve safety pins. He looked at her coat, which was hanging on the back of her chair with the broken zipper visible. Something crossed his face that was private enough that she felt slightly intrusive for noticing it. Take Hector's job, he said. Not because I'm asking. Because you worked for 6 hours in a conference room with some of the sharpest people I employ, and you held your own completely. Because you found what 3 senior partners missed. Because, he paused, because you're good at it, and you should get to do things you're good at. She looked at him. My mother would agree with you, she said. Smart woman. Don't tell her that. She'll become impossible. He smiled, a real one this time, not the almost one from the restaurant, not the corner of the mouth thing from the conference room. A full one, brief and unguarded, and it changed his face so completely that she had to look at her hot chocolate for a moment. Mia, who had finished managing the whipped cream and was listening to everything with the quiet attention of a child who has learned that adults say interesting things when they think you're distracted, looked between them. Daddy, she said. Yeah. Sophie should come back, again, not just for work. The table went quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Mia, Ethan said, I'm just saying. She was entirely unapologetic. She's nice, and she knows about rubber cement, and she looked at the map and didn't think it was boring. Sophie kept her eyes on her hot chocolate. She could feel warmth in her face that had nothing to do with the drink. I'll think about it, she said to Mia, because Mia had asked. Okay, Mia said, satisfied. She picked up her mug. The whipped cream settled. It's better when it settles a little. And that was that, as far as Mia was concerned. Sophie left at 5, as she'd said she would, pulling on her coat in the doorway of the cafe while Mia finished the last of her hot chocolate and waved without looking up. Ethan walked out with her to the corner, which again was not something she'd expected, and they stood on the sidewalk in the December cold with the park visible behind them and the street going busy with the Sunday evening return of everyone who'd been somewhere. Thank you, he said, for this afternoon. It wasn't planned. I know, she said. It was fine. She meant it. He nodded slowly. He looked like he wanted to say something else and was deciding whether to say it, and she watched the decision happening and found herself unusually not in any rush to fill the silence. She liked you, he said finally. She doesn't like most people. She's polite, but liking is different. I liked her, Sophie said. She's honest. She told me my stop technique needed work. She said the same thing to a professional cyclist in this park last spring. He was startled. Sophie laughed, an actual laugh, short and surprised, the kind that doesn't have time to be self-conscious. Ethan looked at her when she laughed. In the way he'd looked at her at the restaurant, at the table, over the contract, the same quality of attention, the same stillness, but with something different in it, something that wasn't about documents or negotiations or what she was going to find if she read far enough. She stopped laughing. They were standing close enough that she could see the cold had brought color into his face, the way it does to people who run warm. I should go, she said. Yeah, he said. Neither of them moved for another 3 seconds, which was technically a very short time and practically something longer. The job, he said. Call Hector. I will, she said. She turned and walked toward the subway entrance at the corner. She did not look back because looking back would mean something, and she was still in the phase of not naming things. But at the top of the subway stairs, she stopped because she'd forgotten something, or convinced herself she had, and looked back. He was still standing at the corner. He hadn't moved yet. He was watching her go with his hands in his pockets, and that expression she was starting to know, the one that was tired and private and not something he showed in boardrooms. She raised one hand. He raised his. She went down the stairs. On the train home, she sat in the corner of the car and looked at her own reflection in the dark window across from her. A woman in a coat with a broken zipper, going home on a Sunday evening, who had spent the afternoon drinking hot chocolate in a cafe on the Upper West Side with a 7-year-old who thought her contract notes looked like a treasure map. She thought about calling her mother. She thought about what she would say. She thought, I don't know what this is yet, but I think it's something. She didn't call. She just sat with it, the way you sit with something that's warm and new and slightly too fragile to touch directly. The train moved through the dark tunnel. She watched her own reflection, not quite smiling. She called Hector on a Monday morning in January, standing in the kitchen of her apartment in one sweater instead of 2 because the heat had finally been fixed. A repair she'd paid for herself, which had felt both practical and quietly symbolic. And accepted the position before he'd finished explaining the benefits package. You didn't let me finish, he said. The position is right, she said. The rest is details. A brief pause. I'm going to enjoy having you in the office, he said, in the tone of someone who doesn't say that often and means it when they do. She started in June, 3 weeks after graduation, which gave her exactly enough time to take the bar exam, sleep for 4 days, and buy 2 suits that fit properly. Not secondhand, not dry cleaned twice and carefully preserved. New in her size, cut for someone who was going to stand in front of people and be taken seriously. She spent more than she was comfortable spending and felt uncomfortable about it for approximately 48 hours before her mother said, Sophie, buy the suits. And that was the end of that conversation. The bar exam was 3 days of controlled suffering in a convention center that smelled like anxiety and recycled air. Marcus sat 3 rows ahead of her, and she could tell from the set of his shoulders when he hit something hard and when he worked through it. She focused on her own paper. She had always been good at focusing on her own paper. She passed on the first attempt. So did Marcus. They celebrated at a diner near school with terrible coffee and excellent pie, which felt exactly right. Hector's firm occupied 4 floors of a building on Madison Avenue. Sophie's office, junior associates got offices, which was one of the things Hector had explained that she hadn't let him finish explaining, was small and faced an air shaft. But it had a door that closed and a desk that was hers, and a window that, if she leaned slightly to the left, showed a narrow strip of sky. She put her bar admission certificate on the wall. She put 3 pens on the desk. She put nothing else up for the first 2 weeks because she was not yet sure what kind of attorney she was going to be in this room, and she didn't want to decorate before she knew. The work was hard and detailed and occasionally tedious, and she loved it. In the particular way that people love things they're genuinely built for. Not with drama, not with romance, but with the quiet satisfaction of a key fitting a lock. Ethan called for the first time in February. Not through Andrea, not through a scheduling request. Directly, on her cell phone, at 7:45 in the evening when she was still at the office because she had a filing due the next morning and the draft had 3 problems she hadn't solved yet. I'm not interrupting something, he said. It wasn't quite a question. You are, she said, but it can interrupt. I have a situation. He said it the way people say it when they mean a problem. One of my subsidiaries received a cease and desist letter today. Commercial lease dispute. The tenant is claiming the lease contains an implied easement that supersedes the explicit terms. Sophie leaned back in her chair. What kind of easement? Access easement. They're claiming historic use of a loading dock that was written out of the current lease 3 renewals ago, but they argue there's an implied continuation based on uninterrupted use over 12 years. Who drafted the current lease? A pause. My old firm. The same one that approved the Swedish contract. Yes. She closed her eyes briefly. Send me the lease and the cease and desist letter, both of them, tonight. It's 8 o'clock. I'm already here, she said. Send them. He sent them. She read them. She called him back at 9:30 with 3 observations and one fairly significant concern about how the previous lease renewal had been worded, which created exactly the ambiguity the tenant was now trying to exploit. He listened. He asked 2 questions. She answered them. What would you do? He said. Negotiate, she said. The implied easement argument is weak but not frivolous. A court might buy parts of it, and courts are unpredictable and expensive. Offer them a formal, limited, time-bound easement agreement in exchange for dropping the cease and desist and extending the lease on better terms for your client. Turn a threat into a negotiated resolution. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, but it's cleaner than litigation. He was quiet for a moment. Can you handle the negotiation? I'm a junior associate, Ethan. I handle what Hector assigns me. I'm going to call Hector in the morning and ask him to assign it to you. You can do that, she said, but Hector makes his own decisions, as you've said. Then I'll ask nicely. She almost laughed. Fine, she said. Ask nicely. She hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of her office, the air shaft dark outside the window, the filing half finished on her screen. There was something strange and uncomplicated about talking to him on the phone in the way they'd just talked, about easements and lease renewals, about her work and his problems, about the ordinary machinery of a professional relationship that had grown into something more comfortable than either of them had probably expected. She turned back to the filing. She fixed the 3 problems. She submitted it at 11:42 and went home. But Hector assigned her the case on Tuesday morning. He did it without referencing Ethan's call because Hector operated that way. Decisions were his, the reasoning behind them was his, and whatever external factors had informed the decision were integrated and then set aside. Lease dispute, he said, dropping the file on her desk. Commercial property, implied easement claim. I want a negotiation strategy by Thursday. Done, she said. She had it on his desk by Wednesday afternoon. The negotiation itself took 3 weeks, 2 conference calls, 1 in-person meeting where the tenant's attorney spent 20 minutes trying to intimidate her with case citations that didn't quite apply to the situation, and 1 moment where she had to excuse herself to the bathroom and stand at the sink for 90 seconds, reminding herself that she was correct, that the analysis was sound, that the other side's confidence was performance rather than substance. She went back in and finished the negotiation. The tenant signed a formal easement agreement and a 3-year lease extension on terms favorable to Ethan's subsidiary. Hector called her into his office when it was done. He sat back in his chair and looked at her for a moment. You did good work, he said. Thank you. The tenant's attorney tried to rattle you in that second meeting. He did. And? I let him try and then I kept going, she said. Hector nodded. That's the job, he said. Every time. That's the whole job. She went back to her office and stood at the window looking at the strip of sky. It was March now. The light was starting to change. Still cold, but with more depth to it, the particular quality of light that comes before spring and almost convinces you. Her phone buzzed. Ethan. Heard the negotiation closed. Thank you. She typed back. That's what you're paying the firm for. A pause, then, it's not why I'm saying thank you. She looked at the message for a long moment. Then she put her phone in her desk drawer and went back to work, because she had 3 other files open, and the message was the kind of thing she needed to sit with rather than respond to in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. Done. She had dinner with her mother in March, at the apartment in Queens, where Sophie had grown up. In the kitchen with the yellow walls that her mother had painted 20 years ago and never changed because she liked yellow and saw no reason to stop liking it. Her mother was thinner than she'd been before the diagnosis. She moved more carefully, but she was cooking. Actually cooking the lamb and rice dish that took 3 hours and had been Sophie's birthday dinner every year since she could remember. And the apartment smelled like cumin and slow heat. And Sophie sat at the kitchen table drinking tea and feeling something in her chest that she rarely allowed herself to feel at full volume. "Tell me about this man," her mother said, with her back to Sophie, stirring something. "There's nothing to tell." Sophie: "I'm serious. He's a client. We've talked. We've had hot chocolate once." "You had hot chocolate?" "With his daughter," Sophie said. "It was completely unromantic. His daughter told me my coat needed fixing." Her mother turned around. She had a wooden spoon in one hand and the expression she'd perfected over 30 years of raising Sophie, the one that communicated clearly that she knew exactly what was happening and was waiting for Sophie to catch up. "What?" Sophie said. "You said his daughter." "She's 7. You said his daughter the way people say things when they're fond of something." Sophie looked at her tea. "She's a good kid. She's direct. She doesn't perform. Like someone I know," her mother said, and turned back to the stove. Sophie was quiet for a while, listening to the sound of cooking, the specific domestic percussion of her mother's kitchen, the particular knock of that wooden spoon against that specific pot, a sound that had been part of Sophie's internal landscape since before she could articulate what a landscape was. "I don't know what it is," she said finally. "I'm not even sure it's anything. He's a complicated situation. His life is complicated. He's been alone for a long time, and I think he's—" She stopped. "I think he doesn't know what to do with something that isn't work. I think that's something I understand. And I don't know if understanding something about someone is the same as—" "It's not the same," her mother said, "but it's where it starts." Sophie drank her tea. "Just don't wait too long," her mother said. "Not because of him, because of you. You've been waiting for things to be right before you let yourself want them, the bills to be paid, the degree to be done, the exam to be passed." She paused. "Sophie, the list doesn't end. That's not how it works." Sophie knew her mother was right. She usually did, which was occasionally inconvenient. "The lamb smells good," she said. "It's been cooking for 2 hours," her mother said. "Of course it smells good. Stop changing the subject." In April, Ethan called at an unreasonable hour. It was 11 at night and Sophie was in bed, not asleep, reading a case file on her tablet because she had a deposition in the morning, and she was the kind of person who read things before bed even when the rational part of her brain acknowledged that she'd read them already and knew them fine. Her phone lit up with his name and she stared at it for one ring before answering. "It's late," she said. "I know." He sounded different. Not the composed, measured version she knew from conference rooms and park corners and Sunday hot chocolate. More tired. The real kind. "I'm sorry. I can call back." "You're already calling. What's wrong?" A pause. "Nothing specific. Mia had a rough day. She had a project presentation at school, the ecosystem thing, and some kids in her class said something. Kids are—" He stopped. "She cried for an hour when she got home. She doesn't usually cry. She's usually direct," Sophie said. "Yeah." His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. The specific helplessness of a parent who cannot fix the thing their child is hurting about. "She cried for an hour and then she fell asleep, and I've been sitting here and I don't—" He stopped again. "I didn't have anyone to call." Sophie was quiet for a moment. She thought about saying something practical. She thought about saying something about children and resilience, about how this kind of thing passes, about the developmental literature on social dynamics in 2nd grade. All of it would have been true, and none of it would have been what he'd called for. "What did they say?" she asked instead. "The kids. That our ecosystem model looked like something a little kid made." He said it flatly, the flatness of someone repeating a thing they found painful. It was actually very detailed. She'd worked on it for 3 weeks. She used rubber cement for the moss, by the way. Worked perfectly. Sophie's chest did something complicated. Of course it did. "She was so proud of it," he said. "She showed me the night before. She'd even labeled all the species. Ethan. Yeah, she built it, Sophie said. 3 weeks, rubber cement, labeled every species. Whatever those kids said, she still built it. That's hers. They can't take that. He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she'd said the wrong thing. No, he said finally. They can't. She'll be okay, Sophie said. She's direct and she doesn't perform. And she told a stranger her coat needed fixing 20 minutes after meeting her. She has opinions and she shares them. Kids like that are fine in the end. They're fine. I know, he said. I know that. A sound she couldn't quite identify. I find it very difficult to watch her hurt and not be able to do anything. That's because you love her, Sophie said. That's what it feels like. That's just what it feels like. Another silence. Different from the ones in conference rooms, different from the park corner, different from all the professional pauses she'd learned to read. This one was personal in a way she felt in her sternum. Thank you, he said, for picking up. You can call, she said. When it's something like this, you can call. She didn't know exactly what she was saying, what boundary she was moving or acknowledging or setting aside. She just knew she meant it. Okay, he said. Go check on her, she said. She's probably fine, but go check. Yeah. She could hear him standing up, the small ambient sound of movement. Good luck with the deposition tomorrow. How do you know about the deposition? Hector mentioned he had a junior putting in long hours on a fraud case. He mentioned me specifically? He said the one you sent me. In Hector's vocabulary, that's a compliment. She shook her head, though he couldn't see it. Go check on Mia. Going, he said. He hung up. She put her phone on the nightstand and lay in the dark looking at the ceiling, which was the same ceiling she'd been looking at for 2 years, with the same hairline crack in the northeast corner that she'd been meaning to ask her landlord about. She was not going to name the thing. She was very close to naming the thing. She picked up the case file and went back to reading. May arrived with an urgency that surprised her, the way May always does. Winter dragging on too long, and then suddenly it's warm, and everyone acts like they forgot warmth was possible. Sophie had been at Hector's firm for 11 months. She had closed 4 negotiations, assisted on 2 litigations, drafted more lease riders than she could accurately count, and developed a reputation in the office for the quality of her document review, which was not glamorous, but which Hector had said, in his particular way, was the foundation of everything worth doing in this field. She was good. She was getting better. She knew both of those things without overstatement, which was new. For most of her life, she'd known her abilities in an abstract, unconfident way, the way you know something you've been told rather than something you've experienced. The year had given her the experience. It had given her the specific confidence of a person who has been tested in real situations and has not failed. She was in her office on a Thursday afternoon in May, working on a merger agreement for one of Hector's long-standing clients, when her office phone rang. It was the front desk. There's a delivery for you, Ms. Bennett. She frowned. She wasn't expecting anything. Can you send it up? It arrived in the hands of the receptionist. A flat white box, no card visible on the outside. Sophie opened it and found inside a wool coat. Deep charcoal gray, beautifully made with a functioning zipper. She stood at her desk, holding it for a moment. There was a note tucked inside. Small, handwritten. The handwriting was precise in the way of someone who has had occasion to sign a great many things and has developed a legible, efficient script. The zipper on your coat has been broken since November. E. She stood there holding the coat and the note and felt something that was large enough that she needed to sit down, which she did, slowly, in her desk chair. She picked up her phone. He answered on the second ring. Did it arrive? You can't send me a coat, she said. I just did. Ethan. It's practical, he said. You've been wearing a coat with a broken zipper for 6 months. It's a problem with an obvious solution. It's too much. It costs less than your consulting retainer. That's not... She stopped. Started again. You can't just send people coats. I didn't send people a coat, he said. I sent you a coat. Those are different things. The echo of her own words from the termination meeting. I didn't send people a coat. I sent you a coat. landed with a precision that she suspected was not accidental. She looked at the coat in her lap. It was exactly the right weight for the season she was in right now, the late May warmth that still cooled sharply after dark. Someone had thought about that. "It's the right color," she said. "You always wear dark colors." She closed her eyes, opened them. "When are you free?" A pause. "This week?" "This week." "Thursday evening," he said. "Mia is with her grandparents for the weekend." "Thursday evening," she said. "Pick somewhere that isn't a conference room." A beat of quiet that had shape to it. "There's a restaurant I like. Small place, nothing like Crown Aurelia. They have good wine and the tables are too close together and the lighting is bad." "That sounds fine," she said. 7:00. 7, she said. She hung up and sat for another moment. Then she picked up the coat, tried it on. It fit exactly right, which she found both unremarkable and quietly overwhelming, and hung it carefully on the back of her office door. She went back to the merger agreement. She worked until 6, efficiently and without distraction, because she was good at her work and her work was in front of her, and the Thursday thing was a thing that existed in its own time and would be what it was going to be. At 6:15, Marcus appeared in her doorway. He'd been at a different firm since January, but they still had lunch every few weeks, and he had the particular instinct of a good friend for knowing when something had shifted. He looked at the coat on her door. "That's new?" he said. "Yes." "That's a really good coat." "Yes." "Did someone give you that coat?" Sophie looked at her screen. "Are you going somewhere with this?" "I'm trying to figure out if I should ask you something." "Then ask." Marcus leaned in the doorway. "Are you happy?" She looked at him. He meant it genuinely, not as a pleasantry, not as a transition to something else. Actually asking. Marcus asked the things he actually wanted to know, which was one of the reasons she'd stayed his friend. She thought about the question, about the deposition she'd won in April, about her mother cooking lamb in the yellow kitchen, about the coat on the door and the call at 11 at night, and a 7-year-old's conviction that rubber cement was the solution to the moss problem. "I think I'm getting there," she said. He nodded. "Good," he said. "That's the right direction." Thursday was warm and then cooler as the evening came in, the kind of spring evening that reminds you summer is coming, but hasn't quite let winter go yet. The restaurant was everything he'd described. Small, a little cramped, the lighting determinedly atmospheric, in a way that suggested they'd bought all their bulbs from the same place, and that place had only had one option. Sophie arrived at 3 minutes past 7 and found Ethan already at the table, which she hadn't expected. He was a man accustomed to making others wait, she would have thought. Or maybe that was unfair. Maybe she didn't know that about him. She was wearing the coat. She'd taken it off at the door, but she'd worn it, and she saw him notice. She sat down. "You're wearing it," he said. "It has a functioning zipper," she said. "It would be impractical not to." He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression she'd catalogued over 6 months. The private one, the unguarded one, the one she'd caught at the elevator and in the park and in the reflection of the cafe window. "How's Mia?" she asked. "She won the Ecosystem Award," he said, "last week. Her school gives them at the end of the year. She got Best Scientific Accuracy." He said it with a composure that was clearly covering something much less composed. She came home and put the certificate on the refrigerator herself. "Of course she did," Sophie said. "She asked if you could come to her end-of-year thing next month." Sophie looked at him. "Did she?" "I said I'd ask." "Ethan." She kept her voice level. "What is this?" He looked at her steadily. He didn't perform confusion or deflect. "Dinner," he said. "With someone I want to have dinner with." "That's what I thought," she said. "I wanted to make sure we were saying it." "I'm saying it," he said. The waiter appeared. They ordered wine. The tables were, as advertised, too close together. The couple to their right was having a conversation about whether to get a dog that Sophie could hear perfectly clearly and was trying not to follow. The lighting was not good. The bread arrived in a basket that had seen better days. It was nothing like Crown Aurelia. Sophie looked at the menu and felt, in her chest, the particular warmth of something she had been not naming for 6 months finally being allowed to exist. "I should tell you something," he said. She looked up. "I'm not—" He stopped, turned his wine glass once on the table. I've been managing everything alone for 4 years, since Claire died. I got very good at it, at keeping things structured, at not needing anything I couldn't provide for myself, at—" He paused. "At being fine. I got very good at being fine." "I know," Sophie said. "And I'm not sure I'm good at the other thing anymore," he said. "At not being fine, at letting something be complicated." "You called me at 11 o'clock because Mia was crying," she said. "And you told me that, which is not what someone does when they're only being fine." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It's not." Sophie set her menu down. She looked at him, at the tired lines she'd first noticed at the restaurant, at the careful composure that was not quite as complete as it had been in November, at the man who sent coats and learned her coffee order and showed her handwritten notes to his daughter because she'd asked. "I'm also not good at this," she said. "I've been busy not needing things for a long time. It's a useful habit and a bad one at the same time." "So we're both out of practice," he said. "Apparently," she said. He looked at her. Then slowly the corner of his mouth moved. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. The wine arrived. The waiter described the specials in enthusiastic detail. The couple to the right decided against the dog. Sophie picked up her glass and Ethan picked up his, and they didn't make a toast. That would have been too much, too formal, too much like a declaration neither of them was ready for. They just drank and looked at each other and let the evening be what it was, which was quietly enough. The dinner at the small restaurant with the bad lighting became a habit without either of them deciding it would. Not every week, not with any formal schedule, but every 10 days or so, one of them would text something mundane, "Free Thursday?" or "There's a place on 46th I want to try." And the other would say yes, and they would sit across from each other in whatever restaurant it was and talk about work and Mia and Sophie's mother, and the cases that were interesting and the ones that were grinding and the particular texture of their days, and it was not romantic in any sweeping sense, nothing that would make a good trailer for anything. It was quieter than that. It was two people who had both spent a long time being very competent at being alone, slowly, clumsily, learning to be something else. Mia's end-of-year school event was on a Friday afternoon in June in a gymnasium decorated with the particular ambitious energy of children who have been given construction paper and 30 minutes of free time. Sophie arrived slightly late because she'd had a call that ran over, and she slipped in through the side door and found Ethan standing near the back with his arms crossed, scanning the room in the way he scanned rooms, quick and thorough, checking the exits before the entrances. He saw her when she was still 10 feet away. "You made it," he said. "The call ran long. I said I'd try." "I know. I didn't tell Mia you were coming." He paused. "In case." "Smart," she said. Across the gymnasium, Mia was standing with her class, wearing a blue dress that was slightly too formal for a school event, and therefore exactly right for a 7-year-old who had opinions about how things should be done. She was holding a ribbon, yellow, which Sophie would later learn meant scientific excellence, and talking to another child with the focused intensity of someone conveying important information. Then Mia looked up. She saw Sophie from across the gymnasium. For a moment she just stood there, ribbon in hand, processing. Then she said something to the other child, handed the ribbon to a nearby teacher with a brief instruction that the teacher appeared to follow without question, and walked across the gymnasium at speed. She did not run because she was almost 8 and running across gymnasiums was for younger children. She walked very fast. "You came," she said when she reached Sophie. "I said I'd try," Sophie said. Mia looked at her with that direct assessment. "Daddy said you might not make it. The call ran long." Mia considered this seriously. "Do you want to see my ecosystem? It's on the table with the other projects, but mine has the ribbon." "I absolutely want to see it," Sophie said. Mia took her hand, simply without asking, the way children take hands when they've decided you're trustworthy, and led her across the gymnasium toward the project tables. Sophie felt Ethan fall into step beside her, a few inches to her left, and she was aware of his presence the way she'd become aware of it over the past months. Not intrusively, not with the sharp self-consciousness of early things, but as something that had become part of how she understood the space around her. He was there. It was fine that he was there, more than fine. The ecosystem project was, objectively, very good for a 7-year-old. The moss had held, the rubber cement had done its job, and all the species were labeled in careful handwriting, each label slightly too large but earnestly placed. There was a small painted sky above a painted water section, and several animals made from clay that ranged from accurately proportioned to charmingly approximate. "This is a heron," Mia said, pointing to a gray clay object that was clearly a bird of some kind. "I know it doesn't look exactly like a heron. I had trouble with the legs." "The legs are hard," Sophie said. "Long, thin things in clay never work the way you want." "That's what my teacher said." Mia seemed satisfied by the confirmation. "But the moss is perfect." "The moss is perfect," Sophie agreed. Ethan was quiet beside her. She glanced at him sideways and found him watching Mia with the expression he got when he thought no one was looking. The unguarded one, the open one, the one that was nothing like the man who had walked into Crown Aurelia 11 months ago and scanned the room without landing anywhere. She looked away before he caught her. Summer moved the way New York summers do, with an intensity that feels personal, like the city is trying to make a point. Sophie worked. She took on more responsibility at the firm, and Hector gave it without ceremony, which was how she preferred it. Her second year of cases was harder than the first, which was exactly right. She found herself in situations she hadn't encountered before. A deposition where the opposing counsel tried something she had to think fast to counter, a negotiation that fell apart on the second day and had to be rebuilt from different foundations, a client who was difficult in the specific way of people who hire excellent attorneys and then second-guess them constantly. She handled all of it. Not perfectly. There were nights she went home with the specific tight feeling of something she should have seen coming, something she'd missed or misread or handled more clumsily than she wanted to. She sat with those evenings honestly, not catastrophizing, not dismissing, just looking at what had happened and what she'd do differently, which was the method Marlena Chu had drilled into them in first year, and which Sophie had found, to her own surprise, that she actually used. Ethan had terminated his contract with his old law firm in the spring. He'd done it quietly, without drama, and hired outside firms, Hector's among them, for specific engagements. Sophie was not his primary contact at the firm. That was Hector, which was appropriate and professional and exactly as it should be. But he called her sometimes. About cases sometimes. About other things, also sometimes. The line between those categories had become soft in a way that neither of them had announced, but both of them understood. In July, he told her that his old legal team, the 3 senior partners who had approved the Swedish contract, had been quietly investigated by the Bar Association. 2 of them had disclosed connections to the foreign investment group that they had not disclosed to Ethan. The investigation was ongoing and nothing had been proven, but the connections existed and were now on record. "How do you feel about that?" Sophie asked. They were on the phone. She was at her desk, late, the air shaft dark outside the window, the city doing its evening thing below. "Angry," he said. "Still, I thought I was past it, but when Andrea told me the details, I was angrier than I expected." "That's reasonable." "It feels like a waste of energy." "It is," she said. "And it's still reasonable. Both things are true." A pause. "How do you do that?" he said. "Do what?" "Hold both things at the same time. You do that constantly. Something is difficult and also okay. Something is unreasonable and also understandable. You don't—" He stopped. "You don't make people choose one frame." Sophie thought about it. "My mother does it," she said. "I grew up watching her hold contradictions without needing to resolve them. I think I learned it from her." She paused. "Or I learned it from years of reading contracts. Nothing in a contract means only one thing." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'd like to meet her sometime. Your mother." Sophie stared at the air shaft for a second. "She already knows everything about you," she said. "Everything?" "She asks questions. She's thorough." "That tracks," he said, with the tone that was almost a smile. "She'll like you," Sophie said. "She likes people who are direct. She'll also probably tell you within 20 minutes that you work too much." She'd be right. "She usually is," Sophie said. "It's exhausting." August was when Elaine called. Sophie was at home on a Saturday morning, one of the rare ones where she had nothing urgent and was allowing herself to sit at the kitchen table. Cleared now, entirely cleared. No textbooks, just a coffee and a brief and the thin early light coming through the window. when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She answered anyway. Sophie Bennett? Sophie? A pause. It's Elaine Voss. Sophie put her coffee down. Of all the things she'd thought about over the past 11 months, and she was honest with herself, she'd thought about Elaine in the specific occasional way that you think about something that marked you without wanting it to. She hadn't thought about a phone call. Elaine, she said, I know this is... A pause. She sounded different from the woman in the restaurant. Not defeated, not broken, but with the careful quality of someone who is choosing each word with more attention than they used to. I know this is unexpected. I'm calling because I owe you an apology. Sophie was quiet. What I did at the restaurant was inexcusable, Elaine said. I knew it at the time. I did it anyway, which is worse than not knowing. I was... Another pause. I was threatened by you, which is not an excuse. It's an explanation and not a good one. Sophie thought about the restaurant, the page in Elaine's hand, the words "can you read" and the way the room had gone quiet and the way Sophie's face had gone hot and how she'd managed it somehow and what it had taken to manage it. She thought about the woman who had said those words, the performance of it, the audience, the careful construction of a moment that was designed to diminish. Why now? Sophie asked. Because I've had time, Elaine said, and because I've had my own experience, this year, of being underestimated in a room, of having someone decide before I spoke what I was worth. She paused. It didn't feel good. And I thought about you. Sophie looked at her coffee. It was getting cold. I don't need an apology, she said. I don't mean that badly. I mean... She thought about how to say it. What happened that night ended up changing things in a way I couldn't have anticipated. I don't know if I would change it. I would, Elaine said. I would change my part. That's between you and yourself, Sophie said. I appreciate the call. I mean that. A pause. You're gracious, Elaine said. I wouldn't have been. You don't know that, Sophie said. You don't know what you'd be if the situation were different. None of us do. She hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a while, turning the phone in her hands. Outside, August was doing its aggressive best, the city pressing heat against the windows, the particular loud stillness of a Saturday morning in a building where most people were sleeping in. She thought about what she'd said. What happened that night ended up changing things. It was true. All of it was true. The evening at Crown Aurelia, with its spilled water and its humiliation and its 16 pages of hidden Swedish legalese, had been the hinge on which everything else had turned. And she couldn't sit in her cleared kitchen table apartment in her new coat hanging by the door and wish that evening different without also wishing away everything that had followed. You could not excise the bad moment from the story and keep all the rest. That was not how stories worked. That was not how anything worked. She picked up her phone and texted her mother. Coming for lunch if you're around? Her mother responded in 11 seconds. Yellow rice or white? Yellow, Sophie wrote back. I knew that. I just wanted to make you answer. Sophie smiled. She got up, poured the cold coffee down the drain, made fresh, and started getting ready. October came with the particular beauty that New York produces once a year, like a reluctant gift. The air going clean and cold, the light angling gold off every building, the trees along the park avenues turning in the way that makes people stop on sidewalks and look up, which New Yorkers almost never do. The Crown Aurelia called Sophie in September. The manager, a different one from her time as a server, a woman named Patricia, who had taken over in the spring, called to invite her to a private dinner in October. Ethan was overseeing a multi-billion-dollar merger, and Crown Aurelia had been selected as the venue for the signing dinner. He had requested, through Andrea, that his lead legal consultant be present. His lead legal consultant was Sophie. She had been elevated to senior associate in September, 7 months ahead of the standard timeline. Hector had told her without preamble, I don't do things early because people deserve it. I do them early because the work demonstrates it. Your work demonstrates it. She'd said thank you. He'd said it's not a compliment, it's an observation, which was the most Hector thing he'd ever said to her. She was 31 years old. She had passed the bar, paid her mother's medical bills, made senior associate at one of the more respected commercial law firms in the city. She had a coat with a functioning zipper and a cleared kitchen table and a mother who was in cautious remission, and a study partner who wore bow ties and was now at a firm 2 blocks away and still had lunch with her every few weeks. And she was about to walk back into Crown Aurelia. She stood on the sidewalk outside the carved wooden door for exactly 30 seconds. She was not dramatic about it. She was not performing the moment for anyone, not even herself. But she allowed herself to feel it, the full texture of it, the 11 months compressed into the space between the pavement and the door. Then she went inside. The East Wing alcove had been rearranged for a larger party, 12 covers instead of 8. The table extended, the lighting adjusted. The space looked different and exactly the same, both things at once, which she was used to by now. The Crown Aurelia staff recognized her. 2 of the servers, people she'd worked beside for 2 years, greeted her with the specific warmth of people who have watched someone's life change and feel partly present for it. Marco from the kitchen corridor appeared briefly through the service door. "You look good, Sophie," he said, with the directness of someone who sees no reason to be indirect. "You too, Marco," she said. She was shown to the table. Several attorneys from outside firms were already present, along with 3 executives from the merging companies, and a representative from the investment group financing the deal. A legitimate one, this time, with documentation that Sophie and Hector had reviewed over 6 weeks with the thoroughness of people who had learned personally and professionally what happens when you don't. Ethan arrived at 7. He was wearing a different suit than the November one, darker blue, which she'd noticed he wore when things were going well. And when he came into the alcove and saw her standing near the table, he did not do the thing she'd watched him do 11 months ago, the quick room scan that settled on nothing. He looked at her directly, immediately, the way you look at the thing you actually came to see. "Counselor," he said. "Mr. Vaughn," she said. It was a joke between them now, the formality, a small private acknowledgement of where they'd started. He smiled at it the way he smiled at things that were theirs specifically, quick and unguarded. The dinner was long and detailed and required Sophie's full attention, which she gave it completely. She was there to work, and she worked, reviewing the final document over dinner, flagging one clause in the indemnification section that needed reworded before signing, conducting a brief exchange with the investment group's attorney that resolved the issue cleanly and without drama. She was good. She knew she was good. She felt it not as pride, but as something quieter and more solid. The knowledge of a person who has done a hard thing enough times to trust themselves doing it. When the documents were signed around 10 o'clock, the table relaxed into the particular atmosphere of a successful evening. Relief and satisfaction, and the loosening of professional composure that comes when something difficult is done well. Glasses were raised, conversation became warmer. Someone made a joke about the length of the indemnification clause that landed. Sophie stepped away from the table briefly toward the window that looked out onto the street. November had arrived overnight, and the first real cold was back, and outside the window Manhattan was doing what it did. Lights and movement and the indifferent, beautiful machinery of a city that doesn't slow down for anyone's story. She was looking at it when she heard footsteps behind her. Ethan stood beside her at the window. He had his wine glass but wasn't drinking from it. He was looking at the same street she was. "How does it feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Strange," she said. "I keep waiting for it to feel bigger than it does." "What does it feel like?" "Like I'm in the right place," she said, which is quieter than I expected. "I thought it would feel more dramatic." "Most good things don't feel dramatic," he said. "They feel like—" He paused. "Correct. Like a thing being what it's supposed to be." She looked at him. He was watching the street still, in profile, and she could see the lines around his eyes that she'd first noticed a year ago, and the gray that had come into his hair at the temples over the past months that she'd noticed more recently, and the specific set of his shoulders that she'd learned to read. The difference between the boardroom posture and this one, the one that was private and not performed. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah. I need to tell you something." He turned to look at her. She had thought about how to say this. She'd thought about it on the subway, in the office, at the kitchen table, in the middle of a deposition once when she really should have been thinking about something else. She'd drafted versions, discarded them. She'd tried formal, tried casual, tried the version where she led with the professional context and transitioned from there. All of it sounded like a contract, structured, careful, designed to protect something. So she said it simply. I was not looking for this, she said. A year ago, I was looking for exactly nothing, because looking for things requires a certain belief that they might be there, and I'd been too busy surviving to have that belief. And I don't know how to do this. I want to be honest about that. I don't know how to be with someone without managing it, without reading it like a document and finding the clauses that could hurt me and protecting against them in advance. She paused. But I know that when I didn't pick up my phone the night Mia cried, I would have regretted it. And I know that the code is still on my door, and I keep putting it on even when the weather doesn't quite require it. And I know that... She stopped. I know that I want this to be what it is. Ethan was very still. She looked at him. His face had that thing in it, the open thing, the private thing, but more of it than she'd ever seen, like something had been held at a certain tension for a long time and had finally been allowed to release. I don't know how to do it either, he said. I want you to know that. It's not... He looked at his wine glass, then back at her. After Claire, I built things. I worked. I took care of Mia. I was functional, and I told myself functional was enough because the alternative was too complicated and I was already managing too many things. He paused. And then you were in my restaurant reading a contract in 11 minutes, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. About you. For months I told myself it was professional respect, and then I sent a coat to your office, and you sent a coat to my office, she said. I know. On a Saturday. I know. He looked at her steadily. I'm not going to pretend I didn't know what that meant when I sent it. Sophie looked at him for a moment. At the window, the November street continued being the November street, completely unmoved. Okay, she said. Okay, she said again. Not because it was a small thing. It was not a small thing. But because after a year of not naming it, the name was simple, and she was ready to say it simply. I'm not going anywhere. I want you to know that. I don't have an exit clause. I know that's a strange way to say it. It's exactly the right way to say it, he said. For us specifically. She almost laughed. She felt him reach over, not taking her hand exactly, just his hand finding hers where it rested on the windowsill, his thumb moving once across her knuckles in something that was more acknowledgement than gesture, more I know than I want. She did not move her hand. They stood at the window together for another minute while the room behind them continued its celebration and the city outside continued its indifferent forward motion, and it was not a perfect moment. The lighting was too bright from the street, and someone behind them was laughing too loudly, and Sophie's feet hurt because the shoes she'd bought for the new suits were still not entirely broken in. It was not cinematic. It was not what she'd have written if she were writing it. It was better in the way that real things are better. Specific, imperfect, entirely, unargumentably hers. They went back to the table. The evening finished. Documents were collected, hands were shaken, cars were called. The Crown Aurelia began its closing sequence, the ambient sound shifting as the kitchen wound down, the lighting in the main dining room softening by degrees. Sophie was gathering her briefcase when she saw her, near the entrance, waiting for a car, standing slightly apart from the small remaining cluster of departing guests. Elaine Voss. She looked not destroyed, not broken, but different. The champagne-colored glamour had been replaced by something more muted, more considered. She was alone. Not the alone of someone who has dismissed her companions, but the alone of someone who simply is. Their eyes met across the restaurant. Sophie had been prepared in some abstract way for this moment, some version of it, ever since August. She'd thought about what she'd feel. She'd expected something, satisfaction or residual anger, or the complicated feeling of triumph that she'd been too busy to properly have at the time. She felt none of it. What she felt was something much simpler and harder to name. Recognition, maybe. The sight of a person who had made a particular kind of mistake. The kind made by people who are afraid, who see something in someone else that they can't account for, who respond to that gap in their understanding by trying to diminish what they don't understand, and who had, from the evidence of August's phone call and this moment's expression, been living with that mistake. Sophie had not spent this year thinking about Elaine. She'd been too busy building something to spend energy on tearing something else down. But seeing her now, she understood something she hadn't fully articulated before. The woman who had held out that page and said, "Can you read?" had done it from a place of profound insecurity. And insecurity, while it doesn't excuse what people do with it, is not the same as malice. It is something more ordinary and, in its way, more sad. She crossed the room. Elaine watched her come with an expression that was cautious and prepared for whatever came next. "Elaine," Sophie said. "Sophie." She glanced at the briefcase, at the navy suit, at the absence of any uniform or safety pins. You did well." "I did," Sophie said simply. Not modestly, not aggressively. It was true, and she was done diminishing true things. Elaine nodded slowly. "I meant what I said on the phone. In August." "I know you did." A pause. "I don't expect anything from it," Elaine said. "I just needed you to know." "I know," Sophie said again. She looked at the woman in front of her, this person who had been a door in a way, who had held out a page and created the moment from which everything else had followed, and felt something finalize quietly. Not forgiveness in any ceremonial sense, just the simple, durable act of putting something down that she'd been carrying without meaning to. "Take care of yourself," Sophie said. She meant it. She turned and walked back through the restaurant, past the table where she'd once stood in a safety-pinned uniform, past the service corridor where she'd once changed in a locker room, past the carved wooden entrance where Ethan was waiting with his coat on and his phone in his hand. He looked up when she came to him. He didn't ask what that had been about. He'd seen, and he understood, and he was the kind of person who left room for things to be processed privately. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. Outside, the first snow of November was falling. Not the dramatic kind, just the tentative kind, the kind that tests the air first, small flakes that weren't sure yet whether to commit. The city received it in its usual way, which was barely at all, the snow dissolving almost immediately on the pavement, visible only where the light caught it falling. Sophie pulled on her coat. The zipper worked smoothly. It always worked now, which she still noticed, which she suspected she'd always notice, because the things that change from broken to working never quite lose the memory of being broken. They stood under the small overhang above the Crown Aurelia entrance while the snow decided what it was doing. "My mother wants to have dinner with us," Sophie said. "She's been asking since July. She's going to pretend it's casual, and it won't be casual at all." "I know," Ethan said. "Andrea told me." Sophie turned to look at him. "Your chief of staff is in contact with my mother?" "Your mother emailed the office," he said, with the complete composure of a man delivering surprising information. 3 weeks ago. She asked Andrea for my dietary restrictions so she could plan the menu." Sophie stared at him. "She's very thorough," he said. "I'm going to—" She stopped. She couldn't finish the sentence because she was laughing, the real kind, the one that doesn't ask permission. "I'm going to have to talk to her." "She seems efficient," he said. "I like her already." Sophie shook her head. The snow was still falling, still tentative, still testing. Her coat was warm. Ethan was beside her, close enough that their sleeves touched, and he did not move away, and neither did she. This was not the life she had been trying to build when she walked into Crown Aurelia 11 months ago, in a uniform 3 sizes too big with a broken zipper and a contract's midterm in 4 days, and a mother in treatment and a loan balance that made her stomach hurt every time she thought about it. She had not been building toward this. She had been surviving toward something she couldn't name, moving forward because stopping was not an option. And because somewhere in her, beneath the exhaustion and the precision and the years of learning to need nothing she couldn't provide for herself, there was still the belief, thin, maintained with effort, not glamorous, that things could be different. They were different, not because of the money or the job or the coat or any single thing that had changed, because she had walked into a restaurant and seen something no one else saw and said something instead of nothing, and because that decision, made in a split second, made from some combination of legal training and stubbornness, and the particular anger of a person who has been told too many times to be smaller, had opened a door she hadn't known was there. She thought about what she would tell a younger version of herself. Not the version from 11 months ago. That version was already moving, already on her way. She thought about the version from 5 years ago, sitting in a first-year contracts class at Columbia with a diner job and a sick mother and the constant company of a fear she managed by working harder and needing less. She would tell her, the fear doesn't go away. You just stop organizing your whole life around it. She would tell her being seen is terrifying and necessary, and the people worth knowing see you and don't require you to be smaller for their comfort. She would tell her, one day you will stand outside a restaurant where someone once humiliated you, and you will feel nothing about it except closure, because you'll have been too busy building something to hold on to the wound. She would tell her, the list doesn't end, but that doesn't mean you have to cross off everything on it before you're allowed to want something. Ethan turned to her. The snow was settling now, committing, finally, and it caught in his dark hair and on the shoulders of his coat and made the street behind him briefly beautiful in the way of first snow before the city got to it. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She looked at him, at the lines around his eyes that she knew now and the gray at his temples, and the particular quality of his attention that she had catalogued over 11 months without meaning to, and which had become, somewhere along the way, one of the things she looked for first when she walked into a room. "I'm thinking that Mia is going to be insufferable when she finds out she was right," Sophie said. He looked at her. "About what?" "She said you should come back, not just for work." She paused. "First time we had hot chocolate, she told me you should come back." He was quiet for a moment. Then that smiles. The full one. The real one. The one that changed everything about his face. "She's going to be insufferable," he agreed. "Completely," Sophie said. The snow fell. The city moved. Sophie Bennett stood outside Crown Aurelia in a charcoal coat with a functioning zipper and felt, in her chest, the quiet particular warmth of a thing that had been built slowly, imperfectly, from real materials by two imperfect people who had each spent too long building alone. It was not finished. It would not be finished. That was not how things that mattered worked. They didn't complete. They continued. There would be hard weeks and cases that went wrong, and mornings when everything required more than she had, and Mia would have bad days, and Sophie's mother would worry, and Ethan would retreat into his competence when something hurt him, and Sophie would retreat into her precision when something scared her, and they would have to find each other again on the other side of those retreats, which was the actual work of it, the daily, unglamorous, necessary work that no one puts in a trailer. She knew all of that. She was not afraid of it. She reached over and took his hand. He held it. The snow kept falling, soft and uncommitted, the way things begin.